At sunrise on an ordinary morning in the Indian Ocean, a Sri Lankan fishing trawler radioed port authorities to report something strange. A diesel slick stretching half a mile wide, fragments of gray-painted steel bobbing in the swell, and life rafts. But no ship. Somewhere beneath those waters, a 94-meter warship had simply ceased to exist. And the thing that killed it was already gone, like it had never been there at all. There's a moment in every naval disaster when someone on shore realizes a ship isn't answering anymore. For the IRIS Dena, that moment came at roughly 05:20 local time. Colombo Port Authority logged the first report, not from the Iranian Navy, not from a military satellite, but from a civilian rescue coordination center relaying fragments of a distress transmission that had cut off mid-sentence. By the time Sri Lankan Coast Guard cutters reached the coordinates, the Indian Ocean had already begun erasing the evidence. Diesel fuel, insulation fragments, a few waterlogged life rafts with shivering sailors who could barely speak. No hull, no superstructure, nothing you could point a camera at and call a warship. 94 meters of Iranian-built frigate, gone. And the question that every naval intelligence analyst from Bandar Abbas to Norfolk was already asking wasn't what sank the Dena. That part was obvious. The question was how. How does a warship that was actively hunting for submarines, running every countermeasure in the book, executing evasive maneuvers trained alongside the Indian Navy just 2 weeks earlier, how does that ship die without ever firing a shot in return? The answer starts not in the water, but in a decision made thousands of miles away. Before we unravel this, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this right now? What country? What city? Drop it in the comments, because what we're about to break down could reshape how every navy on the planet thinks about surface warfare. And if this is your kind of content, real analysis, not headlines, hit that like button and subscribe. You don't want to miss what comes next. Let's rewind. Somewhere inside CENTCOM's Operations Center, probably MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, though they'll never confirm it, a group of senior officers faced a decision that hadn't been on the table for the United States Navy since 1945. Authorize a submarine to sink a surface warship. Think about that for a second. 80 years. 8 decades of Cold War standoffs, proxy conflicts, naval blockades, freedom of navigation ops, tense encounters in the Taiwan Strait, the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea. And in all of that time, no American submarine commander received the order to put a torpedo into a foreign warship. Until this morning. We don't know the exact deliberation. We probably never will. But we can reconstruct the calculus because the military doesn't make decisions like this on impulse. There's a chain, intelligence assessment, legal review. And yes, there are lawyers involved even when torpedoes are on the table. Rules of engagement verification, strategic risk evaluation. And finally, the authorization itself, transmitted down a chain that ends with a submarine captain sitting 400 feet beneath the Indian Ocean, waiting. But here's the wrinkle nobody talks about enough. That authorization couldn't reach him where he was. The submarine was deep. Deep enough that conventional radio doesn't penetrate. The only communication system that reaches those depths is ELF, extremely low frequency. And ELF is essentially the military equivalent of a pager from 1995. It doesn't carry messages. It carries one instruction. Come to the surface and check your mail. That's it. The most powerful navy in human history, with a nuclear attack submarine stalking an enemy warship in real time, and the way they communicate is functionally identical to someone leaving a sticky note on your door. So the submarine had to rise. And rising meant dying, or at least risking it. Now let's talk about the Dena, because this ship wasn't some rusted relic limping through open water. The crew aboard that frigate was doing almost everything right. The captain, whose name has never been publicly released, had just completed Milan 2026, a multinational naval exercise hosted by the Indian Navy. These exercises aren't ceremonial. They're working drills, anti-submarine warfare procedures, coordinated search patterns, sonar employment tactics, the kind of training where you go home with muscle memory that might save your life. And the Dena's captain was using every bit of it. He was running a zigzag pattern, constant random course corrections every 3 to 5 minutes. This is one of the oldest anti-submarine techniques in the book, dating back to the Battle of the Atlantic. The logic is elegant. A submarine tracking you with passive sonar can only measure your bearing, the direction you're in, not your distance. To calculate range, the submarine's fire control team needs to watch how that bearing changes over time, feed the data into mathematical models, and slowly converge on a targeting solution. It's like trying to figure out how far away a siren is by listening to how its pitch shifts as it moves. Takes time, takes consistency. The zigzag destroys that consistency. Every time the Dena changed course, the submarine's targeting math reset to 0. Minutes of patient calculation, wiped clean. The fire control technician had to start over, building a new solution from scratch, knowing the next random turn was already counting down. On top of that, the Dena was pinging active sonar, her hull-mounted system hammering the ocean with sound pulses, searching for returns. And her ASR three-dimensional radar was sweeping a full circle, hunting for the telltale blip of a periscope mast or a snorkel breaking the surface. She was doing everything a surface warship can do to find and frustrate a submarine. And none of it was enough. Here's the thing people outside the submarine community rarely appreciate. The ocean isn't one uniform body of water. It's layered. And those layers are the single most important tactical feature in undersea warfare. More important than any weapon, any sensor, any piece of technology aboard either ship. Below the surface, there's a boundary called the thermocline. Warm water sits on top. Colder, denser water sits beneath. And where those two layers meet, sound behaves strangely. It bends. It refracts. It curves away from the boundary the way light bends when it passes through a glass of water. For a submarine sitting beneath that boundary, the thermocline acts like an invisibility cloak. Sonar pings fired from the surface hit the layer and deflect upward, curving back toward the sky. The frigate's sonar operator sees a clean, empty ocean on his screen. The submarine, 400 feet down, is a ghost. But, and this is critical, the cloak has an expiration date. The thermocline isn't static. It shifts with temperature, weather, currents. The submarine's technicians were dropping expendable sensors called bathythermographs, essentially disposable thermometers on a wire, to measure the layer's strength in real time. And every reading was coming back worse than the last. The water was warming. The layer was thinning. The sonar chief estimated 6 to 8 hours before the thermocline degraded past the point of reliable concealment. After that, the submarine would start appearing on the Dena's sonar like a flashlight turning on in a dark room. 6 to 8 hours sounds like a lot. It wasn't, because 2 other clocks were running simultaneously. The Dena was steaming roughly parallel to the Sri Lankan coast, 20 nautical miles offshore. Territorial waters begin at 12 nautical miles. Under international law, once that ship crossed inside that line, she was untouchable. The math said approximately 40 minutes at current course and speed. And sitting on the Dena's aft flight deck, fueled and armed, was an SH-3 Sea King helicopter, an anti-submarine platform carrying a dipping sonar designed to do exactly what the hull sonar couldn't. The helicopter could hover, lower a transducer on a cable beneath the thermocline, and ping from inside the submarine's own acoustic environment. If that helicopter launched, the submarine's thermal cloak was worthless. 3 clocks, all ticking, none of them forgiving. So the submarine needed to come shallow, receive the authorization, and get back down, all without being detected by a ship that was specifically looking for exactly that kind of move. Rising through the thermocline meant leaving the one thing keeping them alive. The hull would enter the water column where the Dena's sonar worked best. The communications mast, a thin metal tube, would break the surface and potentially appear on the ASR radar, which was scanning for precisely that kind of small, transient contact. The odds were terrible, except for one detail the navigator had been tracking for an hour. 5 miles to the southeast, a South Korean LNG tanker, 200,000 tons of liquefied natural gas, was grinding through the shipping lane. On radar, she was enormous, a blazing return that dominated every scope within 50 miles. The submarine's navigator calculated a very specific geometry. If the boat rose to periscope depth along the exact bearing line between the tanker and the Dena, the communications mast would sit inside the tanker's radar shadow. Any return that appeared on the Iranian radar screen would look like a side lobe reflection. Electromagnetic noise bouncing off a massive steel hull, not a submarine. Picture walking across a brightly lit room while staying perfectly behind someone 3 times your size. The person watching from across the room sees one silhouette. They never know there were 2. It's a technique submariners have used since the Cold War. Merchant ships have been unknowing accomplices in some of the most sensitive naval operations in history. That South Korean tanker was about to play the most important cameo role in the Indian Ocean, and her crew would never know. At 0448, the geometry aligned. The submarine rose. Flow noise built along the hull. The thermal shield peeled away. Ambient surface noise flooded into the sonar picture, degrading everything. The mast broke the surface. Satellite link locked. Message traffic downloaded. Authorization confirmed. They dove. The thermocline sealed shut above them. Total exposure time. Seconds. And those seconds carried the weight of the entire mission. Though now comes the part that defines modern submarine warfare. And it's far more terrifying than most people realize. At 0453, the fire control team finalized the targeting solution. The weapons officer programmed a Mark 48 ADCAP torpedo, the most lethal anti-ship weapon in the American arsenal, and loaded the coordinates into the guidance system. The captain gave the order, and then the submarine did the loudest thing it had done in days. The torpedo tube flooded. Seawater rushed in to equalize pressure, a sharp, distinct acoustic transient. To a trained sonar operator, that sound is unmistakable. It's the sound of death arriving. The crew gambled that the thermocline, the background roar of commercial shipping, and then the biological noise, millions of snapping shrimp crackling along the continental shelf, would swallow that transient before it reached the Dena's sonar operators. If that gamble failed, the next 60 seconds would unfold very differently. The Mark 48 dropped from the tube and began its run. 21 inches in diameter, 3,500 pounds, powered by a monopropellant engine that carries its own oxidizer, meaning no air intake, no exhaust bubbles rising to the surface to betray the shot. Driven by a pump jet propulsor instead of a conventional propeller, meaning no cavitation trail, no white scar on the ocean's surface. World War II torpedoes left a visible wake, a white streak pointing directly back at the submarine that fired it. I might as well have painted a sign saying, "Shoot here." The Mark 48 leaves nothing visible. Its only signature is acoustic. Engine noise absorbed into the ambient thunder of one of the world's busiest shipping corridors. But here's where it gets intricate. A wire, thinner than a pencil lid, spooled out behind the torpedo, connecting the weapon to the fire control console aboard the submarine. Through that wire, the operator could steer the torpedo in real time, adjust for target maneuvers, override the onboard seeker if countermeasures tried to seduce it off course. The trade-off was absolute. As long as that wire was intact, the submarine could not maneuver, could not turn, could not change depth aggressively. Any sharp movement risked snapping the wire, and a broken wire meant the torpedo went autonomous, still dangerous, but unguided, a bullet without a marksman. And there was something else. The submarine was still towing its own sonar array, hundreds of feet of sensor cable trailing behind the hull. The moment the situation demanded hard maneuvering, that array became a liability. You can't retrieve it quickly. Aggressive turns risk tangling or severing the cable entirely. The submarine's sharpest ear and its deadliest weapon were now competing constraints. The boat was frozen in place, lethal, but vulnerable. So let me ask you something, and I genuinely want to hear your opinion on this. Was this strike a justified act of self-defense in a broader military operation? Or was sinking a frigate that posed no immediate threat to the submarine itself a dangerous escalation? The kind of decision that drags the world closer to a conflict nobody can control. Think about it, and tell me in the comments, because there's no easy answer. 7 nautical miles. That was the distance when the torpedo entered the water. It closed at transit speed, roughly 55 knots, and at that speed, the torpedo's own sonar was useless. Flow noise over the seeker head drowned everything out. The weapon was essentially blind, guided entirely through the wire by a technician watching numbers scroll across a screen. He was threading a high-explosive weapon through an active shipping lane. One miscalculation, one wrong steer command, and the warhead finds a merchant vessel instead of a warship. The margin for error was measured in degrees. At 5 miles, the Dena zigzagged again. The bearing shifted on the display. The technician adjusted the torpedo's course through the wire, bending the intercept geometry. Every correction consumed wire. Every degree of turn shrank the margin between a guided strike and an expensive miss. 4 miles. The continental shelf off Gala, Sri Lanka, drops into deep Indian Ocean water. The depth gradient compressed the torpedo's performance window. Too shallow, and the weapon broaches the surface. Too deep, and the runtime stretches, giving the Dena precious extra seconds. 3 miles. The Dena pinged again. The sonar pulse swept outward, passing directly over the incoming torpedo. The Mark 48 was small enough and fast enough that any return would register as biological noise. Marine life. Not metal. Probably. The submarine crew lived inside that word. Probably. 2 miles. The torpedo slowed. Flow noise dropped, and the onboard seeker woke up. A 2-dimensional phased array, electronically steered, high-frequency active sonar, began painting the water ahead. 1,500 tons of frigate displacing water at 15 knots is not a subtle target. The seeker found the Dena almost immediately. Terminal acquisition. The weapon accelerated for the final run. And now, finally, the Dena heard it. Somewhere in that ship's sonar compartment, an operator caught the one sound every sailor in every navy prays they'll never hear in their career. Active pinging. High frequency. Closing fast. Bearing consistent. Bearing consistent. That's the detail that stops your blood. A torpedo passing nearby changes bearing. It sweeps across your scope. A torpedo coming at you holds steady. It doesn't drift. It locks. It grows louder. He hit the alarm. The bridge heard it. The captain heard it. The entire ship heard it. 15 seconds separated that alarm from impact. 15 seconds. The Dena carried acoustic countermeasures, expendable decoys designed to emit noise signatures that mimic a ship's hull, luring the torpedo seeker away from the real target. But deploying them required a sequence. Recognize the threat, authorize release, physically launch the decoys over the side. A well-drilled crew on a calm day needs more than 15 seconds for that sequence. A hard turn? A 1,500-ton frigate at 15 knots needs hundreds of meters to come about. The geometry was already closed. The torpedo tubes on the aft deck could reach 30 kilometers. But firing back required a bearing on the submarine. And that submarine was sitting 400 feet below the thermocline, invisible, silent, untouchable. The Dena could hear her own death arriving and had no idea where the killer lived. And even if the countermeasures had somehow splashed into the water in time, the fire control technician sitting aboard the submarine was watching through the wire, ready to override the torpedo's autonomous seeker and manually steer the weapon past any noise directly onto 1,500 tons of real steel. This is why the wire mattered. This is why the submarine had stayed frozen in place for the entire torpedo run. The decoys were never going to work. The Dena's crew just didn't know that yet. The Mark 48 didn't strike the hull. It passed beneath it. The warhead's magnetic influence fuse, designed to detect the ferrous mass of a ship's steel hull overhead, detonated at the precise point directly beneath the Dena's keel. Not the side, not the bow. The keel, the structural spine of any vessel. The physics of what happened next are almost impossible to convey through words alone. The explosion generated a gas bubble, superheated, expanding with extraordinary violence, that rose upward against the bottom of the hull. The stern of the Dena, all 1,500 tons of it, lifted clear of the Indian Ocean. For a fraction of a second, a section of warship hung in the air with nothing beneath it. No water, no buoyancy, just gravity waiting. Think of holding a steel beam at both ends and pushing upward in the center until it fractures. Except the beam weighs 1,500 tons, and the force pushing it is a column of expanding gas moving faster than the structure can flex. The bubble collapsed. The stern fell. The keel fractured. Pentagon footage released hours later, filmed through a periscope, showed the bow pitching skyward against a pre-dawn sky as the aft section dragged the rest of the ship beneath the surface. 94 meters of warship folded at the breakpoint and slid under. At 05:08, the distress call went out. By the time help arrived, there was nothing but oil and debris, and men in life rafts wondering how the ocean had swallowed their ship whole. Below the surface, the submarine did what submarines do after a kill. It vanished, or it slid back beneath the thermocline. No periscope exposure, no radio transmission, no acoustic signature. The towed array kept streaming behind the hull as though the previous 40 minutes had been routine. The reactor hummed. The ocean sealed shut above the boat. And within hours, that submarine was indistinguishable from the deep water itself. A hole in the ocean with no name, no wake, no evidence it had ever been there. The crew of that South Korean LNG tanker continued their transit toward port, unaware that they'd been the unwitting shield in one of the most significant naval engagements since the Second World War. The fishing trawlers that first reported the debris had no idea what they were looking at. and the Iranian Navy lost one of its few remaining surface combatants to an enemy it never saw, never located, and never had a chance to fight. This wasn't just the sinking of a single frigate. This was a demonstration, cold, clinical, and precise, of why the submarine remains the most asymmetric weapon in modern naval warfare. A billion-dollar surface combatant equipped with radar, sonar, helicopters, trained crew, and fresh exercise experience was killed by something it couldn't find, couldn't track, and couldn't answer. Every navy in the world watched this. Beijing watched it. Moscow watched it. New Delhi, Tokyo, Ankara, Seoul, they all watched it. Because what happened south of Sri Lanka wasn't just an Iranian problem. It was a message written in physics and steel. If you sail on the surface, you sail at the mercy of whatever is beneath you. The age of the surface fleet isn't over, but its vulnerability has never been more exposed. And the real question, the one that keeps admirals awake, isn't whether this attack was justified. It's what happens next. Was this a calculated act of deterrence? A necessary signal in a larger conflict? Or was it the kind of escalation that narrows the distance between a regional confrontation and something far larger, far harder to stop? I don't have the answer. Nobody does yet. But I want to hear yours. Tell me what you think in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. If this is the kind of analysis you want more of, no hype, no clickbait, just the real mechanics of how modern warfare works, subscribe. Because this story isn't finished, not even close.